The biological species concept isn't perfect. It does have some limitations that don't make it applicable for every situation. It works really well on extant species that we study and we know the habitats of, we know the mating habits of, we know whether they reproduce or not, and what their offspring look like. But it doesn't work well when we don't know the reproductive status, right? So if we look at something like a fossil, right? Maybe there's this lizard here. Um, I don't know if it could mate with other lizards that lived in the same population or same area. So if I found lizard fossils from, the next basin over, how do I know if they were reproductively isolated or not? Um, Asexual organisms, so organisms like bacteria, or even many species of plants that propagate asexually, the biological species concept doesn't always make a lot of sense because bacteria can go through mutations at a rapid rate where they're dividing asexually, but requiring them to be able to reproduce together was never really, it doesn't make a lot of sense because bacteria from different species even can share genetic information and bridge the gaps of gene flow without becoming a single species. So we really need something else to talk about species of or strains of bacteria. And even sometimes gene flow can occur between distinct species and produce viable and fertile offspring. So this one we've got an example of a hybrid that's viable. We've got a grizzly bear and a polar bear, and they make the growler bear, and it's viable. They don't live in the same habitat, but if that changed, right? If habitats changed because let's say maybe the planet got warmer, go figure, that maybe they would have a similar habitat, or maybe their habitats will change and then they'll be able to produce this new species and we'll see something else happening. So none of these things really fit the biological species concept perfectly. So we have a couple of different species concepts that we use. The morphological species concepts is looking specifically at the structural features, so the physical features. This is used a lot for things like fossil evidence, where we don't really know much about the reproduction, and also before we had genetic information. And this is very subjective. Two researchers might disagree on how similar two different organisms are. The ecological species concept typically defines species in terms of its ecological niche. So a niche is like the habitat or the microhabitat that an organism lives in. And so this would emphasize the role of the environment. So if we went back to the disruptive natural selection, like we had when we talked about this in chapter 23, where maybe there was a patchy environment and the black mice did well in one area and the white mice did well in another area, but the brown mice don't do well at all, we might see some kind of divergence based on the ecology. And then the phylogenetic species concept is, there's a typo, it defines species as one branch, it should be O-N-E, one branch on the tree of life. And so we typically are using morphological as well as molecular data to sort organisms into taxa. And then as long as they fall into the same taxa organization, we consider them the same species. So we would do this on things like fossil evidence as well, stuff that we don't have, real-time mating information about. And so there's at least 20 other different species concepts. These are kind of the three most common, as well as the biological. So a lot of the times it's very subjective. This is why that distinction between microevolution and macroevolution is not easy, because it's not easy to define what is a species. Is this individual a separate species from this individual? Can we put them in different groups, or do we need to put them together?